that used to not be that threatening become threatening, and then the superstorms like the Katrinas become absolutely devastating.
And Larry, do you have a rule of thumb in terms of how much, what a square mile of wetland offers you in terms of protection from a storm surge?
Well, there's a number of ideas, but one common wisdom is 2.7 miles. About 3 miles of wetlands will reduce storm surge by about a foot.
So if we're losing 25 a year, we have been losing 25 a year. Every time you lose 2.7 miles of wetland, you're increasing the storm surge that's going to be borne by communities inside those wetlands. By
right. As you look out across these wetlands going down toward the coast, and you look on maps, for example, you'll see open water. And so more and more of that open water, as it occurs, that reduces that friction that we were talking about. It allows that storm surge to come right up through without being stopped by anything. And so that's really where our concern is, that at one time, this whole area down here was pretty much a solid mass of wetlands. There were lots of little rivulets and trails and those types of things, all natural, but no more. As you look at the map, you can see what's happened.
Well, let's get out on the water if we can. I mean, to understand, I think the whole country sort of started to understand the importance of wetlands after Hurricane Katrina, started to learn about the causes of wetlands loss. Now to be thinking about this oil disaster as a potentially catastrophic cause of wetlands loss, I think is sort of the next step in understanding we haven't come to yet. Let's see if we can help people visualize that by getting out on the water now. What we saw when we got into that boat and went deep into the wetlands is incredible, and that's coming up next. We'll be right back. The BP oil disaster could ultimately be as much about the survival of the city of New Orleans as it is about the Gulf of Mexico itself and the communities right on the shore. To try to understand why, I went out into the canals of the Barataria Preserve with two people who know all about wetlands and what makes them so critically important, not just to wildlife and flora, but to people living in cities. My guests are David Muth, Chief of Planning and Resource Stewardship for Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, and Professor Larry McKinney, Executive Director at the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi. If you are ever asked to play Trivial Pursuit against these two guys, you have two choices. You can run or you can cheat so they only get questions about music or something, because you really do not want these guys to get questions about nature. So, David, can you tell us where we are right now? You're saying this is a very, very old canal.
Yeah, right there is where what's called Milledon Canal, which was the name of the plantation on the river. This was a back canal. The plantations often dredged canals so that they could get out to natural waterways.
And Larry, when you're looking at a landscape like this, you're looking at open marsh like this, if oil gets in here, or oil gets into landscape like this, what's the effect?
Well, it depends on how much oil there is, of course. But if it gets into it, there's really nothing you can do about it except leave it and hope that it recovers. Because once you try to get into these types of things and clean them up, you do more damage than leaving it alone. So that's why the strategy has to be to get that oil before it comes into these wetlands. Once it's in, you just have nothing but bad choices.
What are the best choices in terms of protecting lands like this from oil encroachment? Obviously, the way that we've seen the oil come ashore right now, it's been here, there, hit, miss, seeping up, turning up in places you don't expect it. It's not a real predictable flow.
No, and that's the problem. It's not going to be. And they try the best they can. They try to protect the most sensitive areas, but the oil is coming in under the water and under the booms and that type of thing. And as we have storms, it's going to wash over those booms. So the best thing that can happen is to stop the oil flow, period, and try to let the marsh recover.
David, in terms of what Larry was just saying about cleaning oil out of a site like this, do you think there's any cleanup techniques that work? Do you just have to leave it? Is there anything you can imagine that would work if there were oil in a place like this? Often
the cleanup is more destructive than the oil, and if you just imagine the Exxon Valdez, where they could take high pressure water and blast oil off rocks and everything. You blast high pressure water here and you're going to literally tear the marsh apart. So I agree. I don't think there's any, I can't conceive of any kind of cleanup that could happen here. And it's not just the marshes. You can see here we've got we've got aquatic vegetation below the surface. That's where the young fish are. That's where the young shrimp, the young crabs, the whole system would be fouled by oil. And here's I guess where it all comes together. There's some ways to try to hope that it doesn't get here. Mostly you're just trying to shut off the oil flow.
There's not that great a way to protect it. Once it gets in here, there's not that great a way to clean it. And you do, as you said, Larry, you do just have to leave it. But once these things have been oiled, if the vegetation is suffocated, don't these wetlands disappear? Don't they just erode?
Well, that's what's going to happen here. I mean, eventually we'll hope this oil spill will end. We hope that it will. Yeah. And when the oil gets into these wetlands, it will kill the plants on the surface. Hopefully it doesn't get down into the roots. But when it does, and if it does that, then what happens is the whole system breaks down and basically it begins to eat itself. And so the wetlands will come back and they'll produce a lot of fish and shrimp and things like that for a few years afterwards. But after that, it's all downhill and it turns more and more into open water. And open water is not what you want in these wetlands. The wetlands.
I'm sorry to slow you down, but the vegetation dies. The vegetation is what's holding the soil that's here together. As the vegetation dies off, it immediately becomes a great food source in the short term, but then essentially the soil erodes. You end up with open water. You've lost everything the wetland offers.
That's right. I mean, these plants are everything here. They're a food source, they're a habitat source, and they hold the whole system together. When they disappear, all of that goes. And as they break down, though, it releases huge amounts of nutrients. And these animals here are very capable of taking use of those nutrients and really exploding in population. So we'll see a period after this is over with when we'll think it's been recovered, that it looks great, the shrimp will come back, the redfish will be here, but then we'll notice a few years after that it'll slowly go downhill because it'll be open water and it won't be the wetland plants that made this thing what it was.
In terms of this spot that we're in right now, David, and what the Park Service is doing in some of the other areas in the Park Service that have been oiled, what preparations do you make, seeing this disaster sort of looming off all this property, some of which is Park Service property? How do you prepare?
What the Park Service has been trying to do is first to get baseline data, to come in and take water samples and soil samples and to get photographs so that we have something to compare with if there is damage. And so that when and if oil arrives, we can demonstrate what it is that the oil has done to the system in order to get recovery from the responsible party.
Larry, I know that at the Heart Institute, you were able to make some estimates of the magnitude of the potential damage here, about what this oil disaster might do in terms of loss of wetlands. What kind of estimates were you able to come up with?
Well, we use an estimate of 500,000 acres, and we thought that was the absolute worst case. And if that were the case, we looked at the ecosystem services provided by these wetlands, which are the flood services and the filtration, plus commercial and recreational fishing. And basically our number hit at $1.6 billion per year in losses. 500,000
acres of wetlands loss associated with this spill. Just as that was your early ballpark guess.
Early and worst case scenario. We just tried to pick a number that some folks have given us some advice. Well, the worst thing that could happen is this. And of course, as this thing goes on, I'm not so sure that may be the worst case anymore.
For a national audience, trying to get our heads around what this means in terms of communicating this to people who have never been to Louisiana, haven't seen landscapes like this. I've never seen anything like this before today. How important is this for the country?
Well, people may not realize it, but 40% of the entire United States drains right here and creates this wetland. So everything we do upstream in Nebraska or Iowa or any of those states, that comes here to the Mississippi River. And so we have to deal with it. And one thing that happens here is because the system can't handle it anymore, we have a 5,000 square mile dead zone that forms off the beach here, off the river here every year. So we got that. We have been extracting oil and gas out of these wetlands for many years, and it's been a great service to us. 40% of our crude oil comes from the Gulf of Mexico, 20% from these wetlands here. These very wetlands produce more seafood than the entire east coast of the United States. So basically, to talk about this is basically, well, it's America's toilet, it's America's sushi bar, and it's our gas station. So I mean, it's
never combine those three things.
But that's really what we are. Because that's what this thing is. The whole delta down here is a huge treatment plant for the central part of the United States, and we unfortunately have not been treating it very well. But the point is that this is an amazingly resilient system because it can take all this punishment. It has been taking all this punishment and still produce fish and shellfish in the quantities that it did. The concern is that how many times can it get knocked down? You have Katrina, you have Ivan, you have Rita, now you have this oil spill coming in here and just keeps hammering the system. And frankly, you can only be knocked down so many times before you can't get back up. And that's the big concern of all of us.
What could be done differently in terms of policy, in terms of engineering approaches, to take better care of this whole delta, this whole wetlands ecosystem than we're already doing?
Well, I think it really comes down to 2 points, Rachel. One is we all have to understand, the entire country has to understand what we have at stake here and be willing to step up and restore these wetlands and get rid of the channelization where we can get the water back into these wetlands, feeding those nutrients and sediment into them and build them again. We got to do that. And the second one is we're going to continue to need oil and gas. We're going to have to deal with that. But we cannot do it as we have done. Clearly, there are many things we need to look at as far as making that as safe as possible, because what is at risk is what we're sitting in right now, and we can't afford that risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Larry, David, thank you both so much. Really appreciate your time, your expertise, helping us understand this. You've both freaked me out and totally enlightened me, which is the best combination for a day in a swamp. Thanks, you guys.
Right.
You can't fully comprehend how bad the BP oil disaster is until you have seen the devastation for yourself. My attempt to communicate that personal experience to you, coming up next.